Every single thing you say and write affects your relationships with people around you. The language you use can hurt relationships. It can lower trust. It can irritate or anger people, and it can drive people away. But let's have ourselves a pocket-sized pep talk because the opposite can be true. The right kind of language can not only improve relationships, it can make people feel seen, heard, valued, and like they matter to you and to your company.
A Pocket Sized Pep Talk, the podcast that can help energize your business and your life with a quick, inspiring message. Now, here's your host, Rob Jollis.
Today's guest, Dr. Suzanne Wertheim, is a former professor and a national expert on inclusive language. She applies science to real-world problems and gives people access to useful concepts that were once stuck behind academic walls. Her book, The Inclusive Language Field Guide, gives easy and practical ways to improve your communication skills so you can be both persuasive and respectful. Happy to have you with us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob. I'm excited to be here. When we met, I saw you MC an event, and I thought, oh, he's very good at that. And so I was not surprised to see that you were also a very good podcast host. So I'm delighted to be here.
Well, now I'm the guest. What was I emceeing?
I believe it was the talent show at the authors retreat.
Oh,
going
yes.
back a year already.
Oh, yes. Johnny Fabulous, I believe, was the name.
I had not remembered that. There you go.
All right. Well, I hope to be fabulous. So we'll get rolling. It really is nice to have you here. And I don't know. I think that one of the issues that I want to start with is that people don't necessarily tell you that they're hurt or offended. They just kind of fade back or they ghost us. And so you write that inclusive language can build trust. So let's start with your definition of kind of what that is, and then we're going to move to how you do that. So let's start with the what.
Sure. So the what is that, and these are coming from, so my ideas I'm going to tell you are based on decades of research that I've done as a grad student, as a professor, now applying things to the workplace to figure out what's happening specifically when an interaction goes well and what's happening specifically when an interaction doesn't go well. And I've also done so many employee experience interviews when I ask people things like, was there ever a time working at this company where somebody made you feel like they saw you as lower than you actually were, or somebody was was ever a time you felt like somebody was pushing you out to the margins or outside altogether when you felt like you were more central? And people, many people had stories, right? And so I collect those stories and figure out what's going on. So what's going on is that there are ways that we can interact with people that show that we have taken into consideration that they might be different from us and are speaking or writing with them appropriately. And in my book, I compare it to event planning or party planning. So if you're planning an event and you're used to event planning, like let's say you're planning a cookout, right? You might go through and think about all the different people who are going to come, and maybe one person's a little bigger. You're like, oh, I got to get a chair, make sure I've got a chair so he'll sit comfortably. Somebody's gluten-free because they get really allergic. You're like, oh, let me make sure those rolls are kept separate so they're not contaminated. Somebody's vegetarian. You're like, I'm going to make veggie skewers and I'm going to put them on the non-meat part of the grill. You've gone through and thought about what will it take for people to show up at my event to feel comfortable and to feel like I thought about them and that I care about them and that I'm happy to see them and that I want them to feel comfortable. Exactly the same thing is what happens with inclusive language. You run through the same things for the different kinds of people who show up, and you make sure that you're accommodating them rather than pushing them aside. So, for example, I'm Gen X. I was raised with this idea that there are only two genders, right? A lot of us in the US were raised English speakers. We're raised thinking that there are only two genders, that you're born and you're born male or you're born female, and that's it. And maybe a few people switch with expensive surgery, but you're done. But that's not how it works at all. And so if you don't change your language to show that non-binary people exist and you might be talking to them, you're already possibly making people feel disrespected or harmed or hurt in some way.
So I'm with you, but let's go back to what if, I think a lot of people, when they get offended, they don't necessarily tell you they're offended. They
Right.
just kind of, we use the term ghost us, that's a
Yeah.
more formal term, but almost a physical ghosting. Um, I guess we just have to, be careful and watch what we're doing. But is there a way to kind of pick up on that or avoid that? I don't. I might be asking for too much here.
No, it's okay. And I've got a story keyed up for you about
Okay.
two words that tanked a $4 million sales deal, and they involve some body language. So I'll get to that in a minute. But
Okay.
I think that, I'm going to say that probably you can't pick up on it. So I'm female. I was raised as female, and I was raised to hide negative emotions because I was taught from an early age and onward that if I expressed anger or if I expressed dissent, or reported that something was problematic to me, that I was told that I was oversensitive or hysterical or aggressive or abrasive. So especially if you're dealing with female people, the chances are good that they're just masking for you and they're not telling you when something is a problem. And I've got a bunch of stories I've collected where people actually complained to somebody about the language and were dismissed. Do you want to hear one of those?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I was interviewing somebody who grew up in Iran part of her life and grew up in Los Angeles the rest of her life. And so she looks Middle Eastern and she speaks with a faint accent and she's pretty. And she worked in tech, probably still works in tech. And she had a colleague, and the colleague kept on telling her how exotic she was. Oh, you're so exotic. Or, oh, exotic person like you. Exotic, exotic, exotic. Now, for him, exotic was an okay word because no one had ever called him exotic. It was just a compliment, like, oh, a place that's far away, or like a food that tastes,
Mysterious. Yeah.
yeah, mysterious, different, like unlike my experience, right? But for her, he'd never been called exotic. But for her, it was a word that othered her. Like she was in a place feeling like she's fitting in, she's doing the work, she's contributing, she's doing this stuff. And then someone highlights, and it's like they're holding up a sign being like, I see you as different. What's most important to me is how different you are. And also, it can be inappropriately sexualizing. Being called exotic, in my experience and data I've collected, often goes in with being hit on or flirted with or sometimes sexually harassed in the workspace where it's not appropriate. So she finally worked up her courage and said to him, hey, do you think you could stop calling me exotic? I've told you before, it really upsets me. And he said, but exotic's a perfectly okay word. Like I looked it up in the dictionary. There's nothing wrong with it. Aren't you just being oversensitive? And so she told me she decided if he said it again. So I talked to her between the time that
Okay.
she told him that thing and the time that he says it again. And she's like, I'm just going to give up on him. Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Classic and so insensitive. The story kind of disturbs me as a card carrying male because it sounds like a 12-year-old. I mean, I get it when you're 12. I don't understand how a grown human being could say, so you're telling me that offended you? Well, that's funny because it didn't offend me. So, so I must be right. That's it's a little embarrassing.
but can I just jump in and say that this
Yeah,
is one of the most common things I hear? So
really.
my book is reverse engineered to address things that people say in my workshops, and I put it right on slides and right in the book. But I wouldn't mind if someone said it to me. But I
Hmm.
wouldn't mind if someone said it to me, and I go through and I say, well, this is an issue of perspective taking. So a lot of people feel like perspective taking is like, well, if it happened to me, how would I feel? And I'm like, no, perspective taking has a second part. If it happened to me and I had that person's set of experiences, how would it land on me? Because
Yeah,
our life experiences make things land differently. And a lot of men don't feel don't feel haven't been, for example, felt like they're in danger in work situations where a lot of people who are female do feel like they're in danger.
right.
So it happens a lot.
That's interesting. Because to me, it seems almost narcissistic to be able to only see it through your eyes. But that's why you wrote the book, and that's why you have the research. So already I'm learning something because you're right. I'm moving in a completely different trajectory from your story. That's why I like it, guests and listening to people on podcasts. It expands my knowledge base. So thank you for that. For me, everybody is kind of tired of Zoom, where you got Zoom fatigue, etc. I am so not tired of Zoom or any virtual communication because I'm always reading nonverbals, doing seminars, being on stage your whole life. If you eliminated my ability to actually visually see the audience, it would be horrible. So I want to see the people that I'm speaking to, because that's the only way I can react without somebody verbally saying that offended me, that hurt me, but I can see it. And I think of the phone now as some sort of primitive device where my eyes are closed.
Yeah.
So it helps.
I'm with you. I gave a keynote this summer for a group of organizational development people. And I was like a villain, like a Bond villain on a big screen with a brick wall behind me. I almost needed my cat, to be petting but they were just all sitting in the room. Everybody else was in the room and I couldn't see them. I could see them from one tiny laptop in a corner. I could see a few things. And then I couldn't even hear the person who introduced me. And so it was so hard I'm used to making eye contact, seeing who's getting it, who isn't. Do I have to slow down? Should I pause and expand something? And it's so hard for me when I really felt like a sensory organ was cut off. And then afterwards, when they announced that everyone there was going to get a copy of my book, that was part of the keynote thing. The person called me for the debrief and said, "Did you hear that roar?" I'm like, "I couldn't hear anything." What? She goes, "Oh yeah, there was a roar of excitement when people learned they were getting your book." That would have been on top of all the things that happen when you're trying to figure out how people are receiving your stuff. That would have been very nice to know. I agree. The more that you can, human beings were designed to have interpersonal interactions in person.
Yeah.
And the further you are from in person, the easier it is for you to miss the cues. By the way, that's why my inclusive language principles and my book are designed also for comms people, for people who are putting things out there and they don't get feedback because they can't see people watching their video. They can't see people reading the press release. They can't see people reading the website. So there are times that you have to be very proactive with your language because you might react in the moment, be like, "Wait, did I say something wrong? Let me fix it." But if it's out there and it's in print or it's a video, you can't fix it anymore. So you need to have fixed it before it went out.
You're reminding me of it's years ago, 30 years ago, but I created my own little miniature study, and it was an exercise where with triangles, where one person had a picture of an assembly of triangles, and we're trying to communicate to the other person who had a blank pad with actual cutout triangles, assemble what we're describing. But I had two groups. I had one that was back to back, and one, then I built these little boxes where they couldn't communicate, they couldn't speak to each other, but they were face to face, but the box was over both their hands. So they couldn't visually see what the other was doing, but they could see their facial expressions. And I never said cue into the facial expressions, watch their face, but all of a sudden an eyebrow would go up or a look of confusion. And quite naturally, the person would go, let me try that again or whatever. And what I was trying to show them is how important it is to be reading that audience. But that was 30 years ago. But I used to love that exercise. And always the group that could visually see the people's facial expressions were able to communicate on a much higher level.
Yeah.
Big shocker.
Yeah. Having said that, I do want to point out, this is a podcast, so it's an audio medium, but a thing that happens a lot is that we forget, when those of us who are able-bodied, so I'm pretty much able-bodied, dealing with long COVID, which is a delight, but I still count as able-bodied. So for a long time, I had to train myself to remember that people are coming to events, to texts, to videos with disabilities. Some people don't hear or don't hear very well. Some people don't see or don't see very well. And so there are all kinds of ways that our language is filled with metaphors where to see something is to get it and to hear something is to get it. That's one thing. I don't think we'll ever be able to pull that out of our language. I think it's very embedded. But I think there are other ways that we can make sure that people with disabilities are included. So let me give you an example. I asked a linguist who's deaf and is one of the creators of something called CRIP linguistics, which looks at, so CRIP is a word that's being reclaimed by the disability community. It used to be only an insult. And now they're like, I'm going to, like queer, like I'm going to use it for myself in a joking way. So he does CRIP linguistics, and then he's deaf and does linguistics. And so I asked him to read the deaf related and disability related stuff for the book. I said, I'll pay you. Can you please read this set of pages? But he was so interested in the book that he read from the beginning and gave me comments on all of it. I'm like, but I can't pay you for all that. I'm paying all these people out of pocket for to review the book. But specifically for the thing about event planning, I'm like, have you ever gone to an event where you felt, hey, they really thought about me. They really had me in mind. Like these people really cared about me. And he wrote, literally never, unless it's an event with deaf people. Like in his entire lifetime, he had never gone to an event. And I had to shut the book and walk around. Well, I didn't shut the book. It was a screen thing, but I closed my laptop and I literally had to walk around the block 2 times because I was thinking through suddenly this guy's experience, PhD, professor, like by all married, kids, by so many accounts, so successful. And he said that he never, ever, ever felt like he was taken into account when he was outside of his marginalized community of deaf people.
Oh, it's an extraordinary story. Man, it's amazing. All right, let's shift a little bit.
Sure.
We have a business audience that's typically listening.
Yes.
Particularly my friends in sales. Okay, so let's talk to the sales community for a moment about inclusive language. How would you connect your book, some of the things that you've worked on, to somebody who is most likely going to be physically in front of a client? For right now, let's just make it one-on-one. What are some tips or ideas you can give them?
Can I start with a cautionary tale first, and then we can see what tips you want to pull from that?
You know what I love about asking you a question? Every time I ask you a question, you say, can I do it this way? And guess what? You never have to ask anymore. I love when people do that.
Okay,
yes,
great.
absolutely.
Great.
You're the
It's
skipper. I'm just the MC.
The problem is you can take the girl out of the professorship, but the professor is always in the girl. Like I always just am like, how can I get people to really see the world the way I do? Like what's the best information to give them? So here's the story I queued up to tell you about. So I interviewed somebody after she had quit a company. This company hired me and they're like, we seem to be hemorrhaging people. It's a tech company. We seem to be hemorrhaging people who aren't white men. Like we're losing them at a really fast clip and they're expensive to bring in for recruiting. So can you interview a bunch of them and tell us, it'll be anonymized. Tell us where we went wrong. The answer, by the way, was almost always professional development and disrespect. They had not been treated respectfully. So I asked this person, I'm going to call her Bianca. She's like a very high level, like very specialized, very important knowledge, high level specialist in her tech thing. And so I said, is there ever a time you felt like you were disrespected or pushed to the side? She goes, oh, I've got a great story for you. So Bianca goes with a sales rep, flies across the country to the prospect site. It's a long sales cycle because it's a complicated thing they're selling. It's partly software, partly services. So she's brought in, like the tech expert for the times that the sales rep it goes above his level. It's a guy. So when it's too much for him, which is fine, fair enough, right? She's on hand to help out. So the client, one of the people at the long conference table, asks a question that's a little bit tech. Well, it's quite techy. And she opens her mouth to talk, and the sales rep leans in and talks over her, and he says, we've got that covered. That's really not complicated. You talk to your IT guy, you talk to your head IT guy, and he'll tell you that our software's got it covered. And so Bianca sits back and she's sitting across from the chief technology officer, the CTO, and she watches her, the head technology officer, the head IT guy is a woman, and she watches her close her notebook, speaking of body language, lean back in her chair, fold her arms, and watch with defensive resistant posture the rest of the thing. And Bianca's like, I think this sales deal just tanked. And it was $4 million.
Ooh.
And indeed, the client said no. And Bianca's like, I don't think the client bothered to tell them why. Speaking of ghosting, there's a certain kind of ghosting where they're just like, I don't think we're going to move in this direction. And so a lot of salespeople respond with, if I understand correctly, we can lower the price or we can throw more in, right? Let's fix what the offering is. But the problem wasn't the offering. The problem was they were pissed. They were angry. So that's the 2 words that tanked a $4 million deal. So my story to salespeople is, if you do your homework, I call it tactical language skills for salespeople. A lot of salespeople don't like the idea of inclusive language, but I'm like, let's be tactical. How can you prepare yourself so in the moment, your autopilot gives you the inclusive thing to say and not the offensive thing to say that, literally will offend people.
Well, I have news for you. I know the sales world. If it's a $4 million deal, they don't care what words you're using. They'll be listening. So
Right.
what a powerful story. Uh, is there and let's get to inclusive language. Are there certain words or is there certain language that you'd want to gravitate towards or away from it, or is this regional? But are there some ones that we can keep an eye on that are pretty much universal?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and things are regional. And that's the thing is, I mean, sometimes people just want a list of good words and bad words from me. And I'm like, A, they change all the time. B, they're
Yeah,
super
yeah,
context dependent.
yeah.
And so my feeling is I'm going to give you a set of principles and suggestions. And then I trust you as an intelligent, capable adult to figure out how to apply them in a given situation. Names. You will never go wrong being respectful and paying attention to names. Never. And I'm really impressed and surprised by how few people do this. It's like literally table stakes. But so you make sure you're saying someone's name correctly. You make sure you're spelling the name correctly. If they've got a little accent, like on the E with an accent like Andre or Renee, you put that accent in. And you don't use a nickname. There are people, I've collected stories. Somebody's like, oh, your name's too hard. I'm just going to call you this. Or they go right to a nickname without asking. I've totally had people, including salespeople, call me Sue. And I'm like, expletive, no, like absolutely not. Absolutely not. So first off is names. Second off is avoiding misgendering. So there are a couple of ways you can misgender. One is that person made the assumption that a hypothetical position, the IT person who was in charge of things, was a male person, because in his experience, in his mental model, that's a male-dominated position. So he just assumed. Most of the time in a tech company, he'd be right. This time he wasn't right, and it came back to bite him in the butt. Another way that we can misgender is, especially since the pandemic, a lot of people suddenly had time and space to come to terms with the fact that they're not quite the gender that they were assigned at birth. So a lot of people, the number of people who identify as non-binary is rising all the time, right? So I think we might be up to around 3% of the population now. If you walk around and assume that you know someone's gender because of how they look, 3% of the time you're gonna be wrong, right? And that's a high enough percentage. And by the way, a lot of trans and non-binary people are drawn to tech. So any of the tech salespeople, you got to be extra careful because the numbers are going to be much higher. So if you say something like a man like you, or the man over here, or this guy, or this he, if you make these assumptions because somebody is masculine presenting, you might be misgendering them and really irritating them. Also, ladies and gentlemen, or the men and women who work in this company, or the opposite sex. There's so many ways that English just sneaks in this assumption that everybody is either male or female and there's nothing else, that it takes time to sort of figure out where they are and pick them out and learn how to replace them with something more neutral.
Well said. Is the word folks okay?
I
I
don't
use that
love
a
it
lot.
myself, but a lot of people like it. So people say to me, I was just on TV in Milwaukee the other day, and I
Yeah.
said, I'm so sorry because this one's so embedded, but guys is not inclusive of everybody. And so one of my examples is if I'm going to the bathroom at a restaurant and I walk down the hall and back, and the first room I encounter says guys on it, do I say gender inclusive bathroom and walk in? Absolutely not. I keep on walking till I find the next bathroom that says girls or dolls or gals or something, right? So guys, I have lots of ways that in the book I talk about, like bam, 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 like guys is not gender inclusive. Then people don't know what to say. And I'm like, a lot of people in the Bay Area where I am say folks, it doesn't feel right in my mouth. So I'll say things like, all right, everyone, okay, people, or if I'm talking to, okay, team, like I'll switch out what I'm saying. If I'm going to intro an event, okay, esteemed guests, it's time, or okay, everybody, there are ways that you find where it came in and you find something that feels okay for you. That's why I'm saying there's no one answer. Like for some people, folks is great. And for other people, like, oh, that's so weird. I can't say it. I'm like, don't say it. Find another thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think, it's that magical line between style and technique. So
Mm,
when you say things like ladies and gentlemen, you're actually, in a sense, referring to a technique. That
mm,
technique has got some issues. If you use the word folks, Well, it plays. I just did a seminar the other day in South Carolina. Played well in South Carolina,
Sure.
and maybe it plays well with Rob Jollis. I just want to make sure I'm not offending somebody with it. And so I think it's that's more on the style side than the technique side. Am I right?
Yeah, agreed. And I'll tell you, one of my more visited articles on my website that people are finding just through Google search, right? So I look every couple of weeks to see who's finding me and how, is I've got a monthly advice column called Let's Talk Inclusive Language. And people email me questions, my readers email me questions, and then I answer them. So the question was, is there a gender neutral alternative to sir and ma'am? And I'm like, oh, I wish. So especially in the South, I went to college in North Carolina, so I understand a little bit of the culture there. There are people I know who literally were beaten if they didn't call an adult sir or ma'am.
Hmm.
And some of those people are now non-binary and they don't want to be called sir or ma'am. They're like, I'm in a bind and I don't know what to do. So I say, so the technique is avoid saying sir or ma'am for someone you don't know. If you know somebody's gender and you know they want to be called sir or ma'am, go for it. But if you don't know, then the technique is stop saying sir or ma'am to someone if you don't know their gender. And the style is find something else that shows that you're polite. So like for client services, like somebody working a desk or something, I'll say something like a retail thing. I'll be like, you can say, oh, the person in the green shirt, I believe is next, right? So there are ways that we can show our respect with tone, with our body language, with our eye gaze. So there's the style, and the technique is stop saying it. And I hope that the young folks, I guess I can say folks, I hope the young folks come up with a good alternative. I think they will. I think that in about a decade, we'll have one, just like we now have Ms. for more than 50 years. So a long time ago, 60, 70 years ago, a lot of people were like, how come I can address a man politely without knowing his marital status? But for me to address a woman politely, I have to know her marital status. Why is it relevant for one kind of person and not for another? So they're like, let's get rid of it and do Ms. So Ms. is somebody who's female and polite, being polite to them, and Mr. is someone male and being polite to them. So my feeling is that there's this need, a lot of people have to be polite. And I think non-binary young people in the Southern US and Texas, somebody's going to come up with something that's going to catch on. I'm just keeping my eyes open and waiting for it.
You can add it to the field guide. The book is the Inclusive Language Field Guide. So let's not lose sight of that. And we'll drop it in at the end of the podcast as well. But as soon as you're keeping an eye on that website, what's that website that you have? What's the address?
The easiest website to find me at is SuzanneWertheim.com. So that's my first name and last name.com. I also have a website for my business that I run. But through SuzanneWertheim.com, you can get to those read, watch, listen posts that I have, like just SuzanneWertheim.com.
Got it. Okay. And okay. So one thing that I really like about your book, by the way, and this is the trainer in me, is that you've got exercises in that book. That tells me that you're not just obsessed with telling me what to do, but you're allowing me to practice. I love that old saying, what we hear, we forget, what we see, we remember, what we do, we learn. So tell me, within the book, tell this audience, the folks that are listening, but the audience that's listening, that's an easy one. Tell them, give me a little taste of the type of exercises they'd see in that book.
Sure. So the book is secretly a 6-month course. I had so many people come to me and say, I need you to write a book. I need you to write a book. I can't figure out how to explain this. And then after your workshop, people are like, sure. And 2 weeks later, they're like, they're right back in their old habits. So when you are learning a new language, that maybe it's a language you didn't grow up speaking, you know that you have to practice a little bit every day. That's like the Duolingo or the Rosetta Stone. They're like, practice a little bit every day. Be ready to make mistakes and get better. Well, it's the same thing with inclusive language. You're changing your language patterns. And for some things like pronouns, it's much harder because pronouns are a different kind of word than regular words. They're what we call a grammar word, and they're stored in your brain differently and they're accessed differently. So nobody expects you to start saying a different number instead of 7. Like, we don't come up with new names for numbers. We don't come up with new prepositions, right? Like, nobody's like, instead of before, now say this. Like, we're not doing that. But now people are being asked to use pronouns differently. And I know it's a problem because most people have said he to refer to a single known person, or she literally millions of times, and have said they to refer to a single known person just a few times. So the first thing I do, and the book is also designed to be for families of newly out trans and non-binary kids. I thought about people I knew and problematic things that their parents said, or aunts or uncles. So I made the book so you can buy it for them. We got holidays, or whatever. Buy it for them and be like, my child is out and they're non-binary. I need you to learn stuff. You just have to read through to chapter 3. I literally front loaded everything that family members need to know. So the first exercise in chapter 3 is practice pronouns for non-binary people. And so do it a little bit every day, like 5-minute abs, 5-minute pronouns. And so I'll just tell them for free, find a non-binary celebrity, somebody who doesn't use the pronouns they were assigned at birth. And it's helpful, like Janelle Monáe looks super, super feminine. I mean, I just said she, well, she uses she and they, but they're super, super feminine looking, but are non-binary, right? So then you read stuff about Janelle Monáe, and then you talk to a friend or a cat or a dog, or maybe you have a practice partner, like you would practice for an accountability partner for exercise. Maybe you got a partner for inclusive language, and you just tell a story about something Janelle Monáe did. And every time you say she by mistake, because you're going to do it, because I did it myself, you correct and say, oh, sorry, they, and you practice in the privacy of your own home. And then when you're on a sales call and somebody's non-binary, you see on their Zoom that it says they, them, or you see on their email sig, it says they, them. You've already practiced and you've got that fluency. And you can also, if you say he or she to refer to that person, you can just do the tiny fix. Oh, sorry, I meant they, and move on, which non-binary people are fine with. They know. It's when people do the over apologizing. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I forgot you're non-binary. That starts to make them feel very othered, right? And like all you're focusing on is difference rather than trying to be respectful. So that's probably going to be my most used and most popular exercise, which is why I put it the first exercise in the book.
Good, like a good trainer would do.
Yes, I have been teaching people stuff about language since 1996. So I have learned what works and what doesn't work.
Right. Well, that sounds great. And quite frankly, trainer to trainer, speaker to speaker, I've always felt that, we can wow a room, but if we're not changing that culture of that company or really getting something that sticks, not only should we feel badly, but you're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of work with that client again, because in the end, that's how they're going to measure your success. Yeah, you were very funny and entertaining. And you know what? A couple of real interesting things. But 4 months later, we don't even remember you were here. Right. A lot of times what's happened is we fell in love with the message. We forgot to take a stop and say, here, you grip the golf club and let's play a couple holes. Let's go play.
Yeah, it's that transition from not having knowledge into passive knowledge into active knowledge. And that's why some of my exercises, I'll say this too, is teach somebody about this thing you just read about and find your own examples.
Ooh,
right?
Great idea.
So that's one way, because when we teach somebody else, it lodges in our brain differently and we really remember it. And when we have to find our own examples, even if we started skeptical, be like, oh, I don't really think this happens to people. This can't possibly happen. That's too rude. And the internet tells you, here are things that people actually say to blind people. Here are things that people actually say to people in wheelchairs. You're like, that can't be true. And then you keep on finding it. It's a way of also getting people to do research and transition and get them to see things that they wouldn't have to see if they're not family members or friends or themselves disabled in a perceptibly disabled way.
Yeah, well said. It's interesting. There are so many, I guess, horror stories that we have, and I'm sort of thinking of a couple for me, but I want to hear one or two from you. You're the author. But before I do want you to know that I so believe in, I don't want to bury that line you threw out there. There's a famous saying, if you want to learn something, teach it. And, before I left Xerox, I said, I want to write a sales book. And I really want to incorporate problem solving in there. I mean, that's what a salesperson does. Mm-hmm. but I don't really know it intimately. And Xerox had a program, it was called Leadership Through Quality. They taught problem solving, quality improvement. It was a 3.5 day long program. And I begged my manager, let me teach that program. And I worked out the kinks, got the hold of it. And I think in the end, it helped me a great deal, but I knew just what I was doing. The best way for me to learn is to just get up in front of a room and work out the kinks and get it taught. So nice point. I didn't want to lose it.
There's no hiding. And I think a lot of people I know who've had small children, like you think, or I compare it when I give talks and workshops, I'm like, I compare it to karaoke. You're like, I know the words to this song. And then the music keeps going, but the words disappear. And you're like, I don't know the words to this song.
Right.
I feel like inclusive language is like that. People, when they're being held by me, or other things that I do where I'm like, here's how to identify bias in interactions at work. Here's how to identify the language of bias. Like I have this 3-part series I just did for a big tech company. And for the last one, 66 minutes of that workshop was them in breakout groups solving problems.
Outstanding.
Right?
Yeah. And what a great example. I'm going to remember that. A bunch of things I'm going to remember, but I really liked what you were just talking about in terms of what we remember, what we see, just the that so many times I am singing a song in the car and I'll even test myself. I go, I know this song, and I'll turn the volume down and go, why can't I think of words? And I'm telling you, I'm on it with the singer, but I so connected to what you just said there. I thought I was the only one, but
it's so
I can't
common.
understand it. Yeah.
I was in a movie theater. I used to speak French. Okay. Then it got wiped out by Russian. But I remember I was in a movie theater watching a Belgian movie, and I'm like, boy, I really understand Belgian French well. And then the subtitles, like the thing went down, so the subtitles were below the screen, but they kept on playing. It's like some art theater somewhere. And I'm like, oh, Suzanne does not speak French anymore. Like I was getting like 50% maybe. So with the subtitles, they're holding my hand. I could read the English and hear the French and be like, oh, I totally get it. And then when that hand holding went away, I was adrift. So that's really what the book is for. My feeling is a lot of people are like, yes, I want to be respectful. Yes, I want to reflect reality. Yes, I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally stepping on somebody's toes and hitting pain points. I really want to do these things. But language is so specific, and it's so specifically complicated, something that we learn for such a long time. Think about little kids acquire grammar so much more quickly than they acquire social competence, right? So many little kids say things that are perfectly grammatical and hilariously inappropriate, right? It has taken us a long time to internalize what is appropriate. And now I'm coming along and saying, hey, I got some bad news for you. There's some stuff that you were raised to think is appropriate, but 21st century etiquette says it's not appropriate anymore. But instead of leaving people out to drift or read a book, in the book, I'm like, you wouldn't read a book about French for 3 hours if you don't speak French, and put it down and be like, well, I speak French now. So that's really why I'm saying you have to be tactical and be proactive and do just a little bit of work. I compare it to like a well-stocked fridge. So if somebody comes over, you're ready to offer them the thing, right? And so it's the same thing with a well-stocked set of inclusive language habits, so that if somebody comes in who has a specific need, right, then you're like, oh, I can make a mocktail for this pregnant person, or I can make a mocktail for this observant Muslim person. Oh, I can, this person, I'm trying to think of a good example. This person, I keep on coming to disability, but this person is blind. So let me make sure that I describe certain things, and let me make sure that I don't
say things like, as you can see, or things like that. That's always my nightmare.
Again, honestly, I think that most people don't love it from what I've been reading, but they accept that the metaphors are so embedded that we can't do it.
Okay.
But there are ways that sometimes we'll just have a facial expression, or there are ways that you have to shift when you realize that somebody isn't taking in information that you're putting out. And so, yeah, that's why I did this as a course, as a 6-month course. So the idea is you read the book in one sitting or 2 sittings, whatever. People are saying it's pretty fast to read. I had somebody help me take out, she said, isn't this a linguistic digression, my developmental editor? I'm like, it's a fun fact everyone needs to know. She goes, but is it? Is it? So the book is very streamlined because I paid somebody to make me take things out. But the idea is that then the stuff that you need to learn, like you're a grandparent of a newly out trans kid, you're like, what do I do? You go back and you read the Reflect Reality chapter, and you practice the things, and you really get in there with what's the reality of gender and sexual orientation, and a lot of stuff that I had to learn through research. I didn't learn it in any school environment. So,
Yeah. Give me one thing that people who want to grasp onto this, make a high impact change right now, right away. Give me one thing that they can walk away with from this podcast that they can take with them.
so this one isn't that frequent, but it's so painfully bad that it lands on people. They remember it for years and decades later as something that's terrible that happened to them. So I'm going to give this as the takeaway to not do, which is don't give an unconscious demotion. An unconscious demotion is when you meet somebody for the first time and you make a snap judgment and you assume that the role that they have is lower than their actual role. So it most frequently in the US, it's to women of color, then to white women, then to people who appear to be male of color, and perceptibly disabled people in the workplace. So I have so many stories of, I just opened my keynote with this in Milwaukee last week. Melody Hobson, who is at the time was a very prominent, it's still a very prominent investment firm president, right, in Chicago, incredibly well-dressed, organizes a media lunch for her friend who's going to run for Senate in New York. They fly to New York. They show up at the front desk. They're both Black. They're wearing, I know where she shopped in Chicago. I dreamed of shopping there. She's wearing at least a 5K suit, probably more, at least, and probably a $20,000 handbag, just knowing her stuff. They show up at the front desk and they say, the receptionist, we're here for the lunch. And the receptionist says, oh, great. Takes them through a winding hallway to a back room and then turns around and says, wait, where are your uniforms? Because she thinks that they're catering staff.
Ooh.
This is the guest of honor. And this is the co-organizer of the event. Because they're Black, she assumed that they were help. And this happens again and again and again. And I've heard sales rep stories of this happening where somebody's in a room and the person comes in and says, oh, hey, do you think you could get me some coffee? I've got an important meeting here. And the important meeting is with that vice president that he mistook for an admin, right? So a lot of times, so that I'm going to say, don't do that and ask open-ended questions instead. Like, hi, what brings you here, right? Or what are you doing here? Rather than so many times, oh, does your boyfriend code games? Or I hear it with musicians. There's so many things where people just assume that the person that they're talking to is so much lower, and then they are the decision maker. So whatever you can do, I've got a quick read in Fast Company about unconscious emotions, where you can read it in like maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and I give you tips on how to avoid it, because these are stories, I'm telling you, they last. Melody Hobson opened up her TED Talk 8 years after that happened with that story because it still hurt so much, right? This is a woman who has encountered so many things. So that's my number one. It's not the most frequent, but I'm going to say it's one of the most hurtful.
Good. Well, and now we've all heard it and learned from it. The book is the Inclusive Language Field Guide. I think it's on, I'm assuming, every store online, Amazon, all that. How's it doing?
Bestseller in at least one of its categories every day since it was released in Amazon. Doing well on Audible. Very good reviews, 5-star reviews, people emailing me. Somebody we both know told me he's going to put it on his 10 best business books of the year for financial advisors.
I think I know who that is. Yep.
He just emailed me to tell me that. Put up for some awards. People keep on emailing me and telling me how genuinely useful it is. And to me, that is, I didn't write a book for ego. I wrote a book because people are stressed, right, and people are nervous. And I'm like, I got you. Right. So yeah, it's doing great. Thanks for asking.
Outstanding. You know, I've always loved the quote, we weren't put on this earth to make a living. We were put on this earth to make a difference. And it sounds like that's just what this book is doing. So I congratulate you. And I'm thrilled to have had you on here. How do people get a hold of you?
Find me at SuzanneWertheim.com.
Okay. And let's spell that a little. SuzanneWertheim. And if that went by too fast, don't worry. We'll have it on our website, etc. And I think if you just grab that title and Google, you'll get the correct spelling. So they'll be able to find you. I want to thank you for being on. I enjoyed it. Learned a couple things. And I just found the conversation delightful. So thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. And everybody, good luck. You can make small changes and do better. You can do it.
Well, there you go. We'll do it again as well as we can next time, everyone. Until then, stay safe.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please rate and recommend it on iTunes, Outcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information on this show and Rob at jollis.com.